Pope John VIII. On a cold December night in 882 AD, the most powerful man in Christendom sat down to drink with the people closest to him. He was 70 years old, had reigned for a decade, and had spent most of that decade making enemies. That night, his inner circle had finally had enough. John VIII was the first pope to be unambiguously assassinated. During his 10 years as pope, he'd excommunicated 2 Holy Roman emperors, negotiated with Viking raiders, and tried to hold a fractured Catholic world together through sheer political willpower. He'd survived at least 2 serious conspiracy attempts before this one. He even wrote letters, still surviving today, describing plots against his life in graphic terms. He knew they were coming. He just didn't know when. On December 16, 882, members of his own household slipped poison into his wine at dinner in Rome. He began to convulse. The dose was either too small or took too long. Someone at the table, account vary on who, decided not to wait. They picked up a hammer and beat him over the head until he stopped moving. The Pope of Rome, Vicar of Christ on earth, was bludgeoned to death at the dinner table because his poisoning was going too slowly. He left no clear successor, and the papacy entered decades of chaos. Historians would later call this period the pornocracy. That's a real word. Look it up. Pope Adrian III. In the summer of 885 AD, a 55-year-old pope set out on a journey from Rome toward Worms, Germany, to mediate yet another imperial succession crisis. He never arrived. He died suddenly on the road near Modena, Italy, on July 8, 885, and was buried so quickly by his own traveling retinue with no ceremony that people started asking questions almost immediately. Adrian had reigned less than 2 years, but he'd made powerful enemies fast. Within weeks of becoming pope, he had a Roman nobleman named George of the Aventine blinded and mutilated in the street without trial, and had George's mother publicly flogged and then exiled. In the 9th century, even by the standards of a brutal age, that was considered extreme. The Roman aristocracy took note. When he died on that road near Modena, no cause was recorded. No illness had been documented. He'd been healthy enough to travel. The burial was rushed. His body interred at a local abbey called Nonantola before anyone from Rome could observe the condition of the corpse. Poison was almost certainly involved, though no one was ever charged. The primary suspects were the same Roman noble families he'd brutalized on his way up. His rushed, unmarked roadside burial meant there was nothing to examine and no one to question. He was canonized as a saint in 1891. The Catholic Church, apparently, has a sense of irony. Pope Sergius III. This one is less a murder mystery and more a murder certainty. It just happened before he was pope, not after. In January 897 AD, Pope Stephen VI did something that has never been repeated in the history of any institution on earth. He had the corpse of his predecessor, Pope Formosus, exhumed from its grave, dressed in papal vestments, propped up in a chair, and put on trial. The decomposing body sat in the courtroom for the duration of the proceedings. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse. Formosus, 9 months dead, was found guilty of perjury and violating church canons. His papal vestments were torn from his rotting body. The 3 fingers on his right hand used for ordinations were cut off, and his body was thrown into the Tiber River. This event is called the Cadaver Synod. It is exactly what it sounds like. Stephen VI was immediately deposed by a furious Roman mob, strangled in prison, and thrown into the same river. The body of Formosus was fished out of the Tiber by monks who quietly reburied it. 4 popes came and went in the next 2 years. Sergius III, who had actually presided at the Cadaver Synod as a bishop, eventually clawed his way to the papacy in 904 AD and had 2 of his immediate predecessors, Popes Leo V and Christopher, strangled in prison within months of taking office. Sergius III died of natural causes in 911. Some men simply outlast their era. Pope John I. On May 18th, 526 AD, a 76-year-old pope died in a prison cell in Ravenna, Italy. He had just returned from Constantinople, the first pope ever to visit the Eastern Emperor, and had been thrown directly into a cell by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great the moment he arrived back on Italian soil. John had traveled to Constantinople under orders from Theodoric himself, tasked with convincing the Eastern Emperor Justin I to reverse a policy persecuting Arian Christians. The trip had been a political disaster for Theodoric. Justin I had received John with enormous honor, crowning him, seating him above the Eastern Patriarch, which was exactly the kind of papal prestige that made Ostrogothic kings nervous. Theodoric suspected John of negotiating privately against Gothic interests. He probably wasn't wrong. John was arrested on arrival back in Ravenna. He was 76 years old, had spent months traveling across the Mediterranean, and was placed in a cell with no medical care and insufficient food. He survived exactly 48 days before dying of what his contemporaries called neglect, which in the political language of the 6th century meant deliberate deprivation. He was never tried, never charged, and never given the opportunity to speak in his own defense. He was dead within 6 weeks of arriving home. Theodoric himself died 4 months later. Some would call that divine timing. Theodoric's biographers would not. John I was declared a martyr and saint almost immediately. He remains the only pope in history to die in the direct custody of a foreign king. Pope Clement II. Clement II died on October 9, 1047, at the age of 36, after a reign of less than 10 months, in the monastery of San Tommaso in Foglia, near Pesaro, Italy. He appeared to be in good health until he wasn't. The death was sudden and unexplained. He'd been appointed pope personally by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, essentially a political installation rather than a canonical election, and had spent his brief reign fighting corruption within the church. He passed legislation specifically targeting the practice of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, which made him an immediate enemy of every powerful bishop and cardinal who had purchased their position. In 1958, German researchers exhumed his body, one of the best preserved medieval papal remains in existence, and analyzed the tissue. They found lethal levels of lead monoxide in his bones and organs, not trace amounts, enough to kill. The concentration suggested deliberate, sustained poisoning administered over weeks, almost certainly through contaminated food or drink. The lead had been introduced precisely and repeatedly. Someone with regular access to the Pope, a servant, a cook, a trusted attendant, had been dosing him methodically. He was 36 years old. No one was ever identified. The paperwork, if it ever existed, did not survive the 11th century. Pope Boniface VI, April 896, AD 15 days. That is the entire pontificate of Boniface VI, the shortest unambiguous papal reign in history. He was elected in April, he was dead by April, and the circumstances have been disputed ever since. Boniface was a controversial choice from the start. He'd been suspended from holy orders twice, once as a subdeacon, once as a priest, for what church documents vaguely describe as immoral conduct. He was elected anyway, during a moment of political chaos following the Cadaver Synod crisis, which tells you something about what the standards had become. Within 2 weeks, he was dead. Official cause: gout. Contemporary chroniclers were skeptical. Gout, even severe gout, does not kill a man in 2 weeks without some additional assistance. The timing, immediately after a violently destabilizing moment in the papacy, with multiple factions maneuvering for control, strongly implies intervention. His successor, Stephen VI, the man who would go on to conduct the Cadaver Synod, took office within days. No charges were brought, no investigation was recorded. Boniface VI has the distinction of being the only pope in history to have been defrocked twice before becoming pope, and then possibly murdered after 15 days in office. History has been unkind to him. He didn't have time to give it much to work with.